Hey guys, welcome back to the latest episode of the Growing a Dental Practice podcast. I'm your host, Mike Hennon from Patient Boost. In today's episode, I'm joined by dental attorney Robert Lawson. Sorry, is it Lawson or Larson?
Larson.
Right, I don't normally do that. Sorry, I'm going to go. You're Lawson of Law. Right, I'm going to start again. I don't normally do that, so we'll gloss over that. Hey guys, welcome back to the latest episode of the Growing a Dental Practice podcast. I am your host, Mike Hennon from Patient Boost. In today's episode, I'm joined by dental attorney Robert Larson. Based in the state of New York, Robert has spent the past 10 years exclusively representing dentists and other healthcare professionals in all areas of transactional law. Welcome to the show, Robert. Thanks for joining me today. How are you?
Doing very well today. It's kind of an overcast day, but we had a very nice weekend and I got to spend it with some family. So we need the rain. We desperately need the rain here in New York. So it's nice.
Excellent. Yeah, it's literally it's just gone sunny where I am. But it was raining earlier, and I think we're the same. Like everywhere seems to be in drought. Like yes. It's mad, isn't it?
Very, very. We did. Like I said, we really need the rain. And it's one of those things where don't complain. Don't complain. We're getting something we have been asking for. So, and I'm at work, so I'm sitting at a desk. It's not like I'm going to be out and about running around outdoors. So it's a good thing.
Excellent. Well, I've been really looking forward to this episode. Actually, I think you might be our first attorney, so this is going to be exciting. And obviously, hopefully,
hopefully I won't put a bad taste in anybody's mouth.
No, I'm sure it's going to be brilliant. So obviously, we've known each other for a few months now, haven't we? Actually, it's probably going back to sort of, is it March, April time when we sort of first introduced?
Yes.
Excellent. So I obviously know you fairly well now, but I'm hoping to share your story with our audience and then give everyone an insight into kind of, the world of the law and legal. Obviously, we're talking about transactional things. We're not doing litigation, which is a very different thing, as you keep telling me.
Mm-hmm.
So without further ado, I would love to dig into who Robert Larson is. So tell me about you and what's your background?
So my background is wide and varied. I've been a nurse for 30 years this year, which is a very long time. I obviously have not worked as a nurse for 30 years, but I'm still licensed. I stopped working as a nurse back in, the last day I did nursing services for anyone was July 28th of 2006. It's one of those things where you remember the last day you had to clean somebody's backside type of deal. And that was because I was starting law school 2 weeks later. So I've been licensed since 92, but I haven't practiced since 2006. After I had gotten my nursing degree, so I went and got my nursing degree very young, and then I did school back and forth and on and off again through the years, and eventually I ended up with a philosophy degree. And there's, not to dissuade your listeners from getting a philosophy degree, which I think is a wonderful thing to do. There's not like you can get a job like at a philosophy office. They just don't exist. So it was a matter of, well, what am I going to do? And I had studied so the joke is for philosophy people, there's 3 jobs you can have. You can teach philosophy, and I didn't want to do that because I made more money as a nurse. You can become a priest, and I had studied to be a priest for a number of years, and that wasn't going to work. So the last option was become a lawyer. So luckily I have a very supportive spouse. I was able to apply to law school. I went to law school in Minnesota, in the United States. And then literally 7 days after I graduated from law school, I was living in New York. I had moved in the intervening 7 days from graduated on a Thursday, started packing on Friday, and the following Thursday drove to New York. So I took the New York bar, and my very first job as an attorney in 2011 was doing dental law. I worked in the back of an orthodontist. I worked for an orthodontist attorney, and in the back of his orthodontic clinic, he had converted a storage closet into his law practice. So I practiced in the back of an orthodontic office. And it was funny because because I'm a lawyer, I had to do all of the payroll and human resource stuff for the 10 or 12 people who worked in the orthodontic office. And that's what I did for a number of years. And eventually in January of 2021, after having worked at 2 prior firms and somewhere remotely, I went out on my own doing this. So I have, for coming up on 12, at least 11 years now, I'm in my 12th year. I've worked exclusively with dentists. I do a little bit of work with optometrists, chiropractors, and vets because the law in New York and in New Jersey is so similar, and the differences are so easily countable on one hand. So if they come along, I like working with them, but 98% of my practice is dentists.
Fantastic. See, I knew about your nursing background, and I knew you're a dental attorney. I didn't realize there was the philosophy in between. So does that explains the jump from nursing to lawyer?
Yes. Yep. That's that. Well, that and there's not a lot of staffing in nursing, and it's nursing is a really, really difficult job. I always tell my clients and people that I work with what I do. No matter how badly we mess something up, no one's going to die. So I bring a very, very different perspective to how to do legal work, because I'm like, all of this is incredibly, incredibly important and should be done correctly. But everything is fixable. Everything is fixable. So don't lose sleep over it. Enjoy yourself, and let's get it done right the first time around.
Fantastic. And so you obviously became a dental focused attorney because of that first engagement, that first job.
Correct. Well, basically, so I always tell people, if you remember what 2009 was like, 2010, the economy was kind of not doing quite well. It was actually doing terribly, and there were no jobs. There literally were no jobs, and it was either a matter of go out on your own, which is not necessarily the best idea for a new attorney, I don't feel. And I actually answered an online ad on Craigslist for someone looking for an associate who was barred in New York and had healthcare experience. Now, mind you, I said healthcare experience, not health law experience. I had no experience as a lawyer. And I thought, well, that's me. I have a lot of healthcare experience and I have a law degree. And I just need to do something with it. And that's how I got hired into doing what I was doing. And I've rather enjoyed it. It's been very good.
Fantastic. Have you ever tried to leave dental, or is it one of those things that once you're in, you're in?
So it's, I always say that I'm highly concentrated, and someone was like, "You're like laser focused," and was like, I know other attorneys who they do real estate and family law and wills and trusts, and so they practice kind of broadly. Whereas what I do is not, everything that is related to the dental practice. I know that stuff really well, forward and back. Once you get too far outside of it, I'm like, nope, that's I don't help clients buying and selling the underlying real estate, because that's too outside of what I do, and it's its own area of practice. It's kind of like, if you need a implant done, you don't generally go to a general dentist. You go to an oral surgeon and a periodontist. You don't go to, so that's kind of what is going on here. I'm not a general practice attorney, so I can't help somebody, like I can't help a real estate agent who wants to set up their own business. I can't help friends of mine who own like storefronts and stuff. I'm not the right person for it. But what I am right for, I know really, really well, because this is all that I do.
Yeah.
Kind of like a pediatric dentist is qualified to do general dentistry, but they don't, because they know pediatrics really, really well, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think using that the dental analogy for yourself really obviously makes it very easy to sort of like explain to clients why you do that. Mm-hmm. So you've already mentioned that obviously your nursing career kind of obviously helped you get your first job in law. It helped you kind of, and I love that. I say that to myself as well. Like, if nothing I do is gonna kill the client or what have you. So I think that's given you a good perspective. Is there anything else in your like nursing career that has helped you prepare for a life as a dental attorney? Like any other lessons from those days?
I think, it's funny. Nursing never leaves. It just is. If once you're a nurse, it's like, it sticks. So I see a lot of the world around me through that lens, and it's like remain detached, remain reasonable. What needs to be done, and then do it in that order. It's like, so it kind of flavors, or it has kind of poisoned me for the rest of my life. Most things don't faze me. because what I do now is I push papers around. That's what I do. I push papers around and I talk to people. Whereas it used to be, cleaning up people, helping in crash situations, because I worked everything from an orthopedic trauma center at a level 4 facility, which is the highest trauma facility you can have in the United States, to medical rehab. And then I was an Alzheimer's dementia nurse. So it's like, it's like, let's just get this done. What makes it really good is that it's kind of like crisis avoidance. When things are, I always tell clients, let's figure out how to solve the problem as opposed to kind of wallowing in it, because it's not doing us any good. And I think most nurses have that kind of mindset. It's like, what do I need to do to solve whatever's the issue to get us where everybody's happy again? And I think it helps out a lot. Like you mentioned earlier, I'm a transactional attorney. I'm not a litigator. Generally, most of my clients are very happy with, they're doing exciting life events. They're getting their first job. They're opening a practice, or they're buying a practice. They're hiring their first associate because they're too busy to do it on their own. And then eventually they're selling their practice. So when I look at it, it's all these major life events that should be exciting. Anxiety producing, yes. And I always remind clients, anxiety and excitement are kind of very similar, fine line between the two. I'm like, so if you're having a lot of anxiety, tell yourself this is excitement because of what you're getting to do. And then I joke with them, you're taking out a $1.5 million loan. You should have a lot of anxiety, but it's excitement because something big is going on. I think it helps generally with where clients are at. I don't litigate. I don't go to court. I'm not the person to do that. Could I do it? Probably could. Just there's so much specific in going to court. It's kind of like in England, barristers and counselors are vastly different. In America, you can be a transactional attorney and do litigation, or be a litigation attorney and still do. I know where I'm good. I know where my talents lie, and that's where I sit.
Yeah,
and
fantastic.
The nice thing for clients is this is all I do. You don't have to worry about like trying to explain to me, well, what's accounts receivable? What are AR? And how is it different for orthopedics as opposed to a general dental office, which they're vastly different. Accounts receivable are vastly different for ortho and a general dentist or a non-orthodontic dentist. So I'm able to bring that kind of experience and knowledge, which translates into efficiency, which means I'm going to be less expensive as a general rule than someone who works with the busing company and who works with plumbers and helps with their businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've already kind of covered some of the examples of where you get involved and how you help your clients. Are there any other examples of you helping clients or when you step in and that kind of thing?
So what to me is always odd is like the off comment where a client will call up or former clients will call up because they have a question about A, and just in the general conversation we're talking and they mention it's not A, it's not even near A, it's like DZXY, and I'm like, that's an important comment you just made. To give a very concise example, I had a client call me up and she was asking me questions about her lease. So we're discussing the lease, and she just casually mentioned that she's discharging a patient. Well, she had basically said, I'm sending an email to this patient today to tell her I won't treat her anymore and she can't come back. And for me as the attorney, it was like, okay, that we need, that's a full stop. You and I need to discuss that. And so I started asking, I'm like, well, what exactly do you mean you're going to email her and tell her you won't see her anymore? She's like, oh, we saw her yesterday. She came in, the patient, and she treated everybody horribly, and she screamed and yelled at a couple of people, and I just don't. And I was like, okay, that's a reasonable person to say, I will no longer treat you as a provider. However, you can't email her and say you can't come back ever again. I won't see you ever again, because that most anywhere is going to be considered patient abandonment, and that's a very serious thing for any medical provider to do, because in New York it's called the Office of Professional Discipline, or OPD. OPD will come in and investigate you, and when they do that, everything is open, all your finances, all your patient records, everything, and they will find where you forgot to put a comma that it needed a comma, and it's one of these instances where you can, as a dental provider, you can technically have an action against your license and potentially lose your license. So I was like, so this is what we need to do. This is the process to tell that patient you will no longer be going to see her. And so we walked through it, we talked about it, and the dentist, she was She's like, oh, she's like, now I'm terrified. I'm like, well, don't be terrified. Be alert and be concerned as to what it is that you're doing, because sometimes there's significant legal implications. So she discharged the patient in the appropriate way. She gave her notice, she gave her opportunity to get copies of her records, and she gave her a 30-day window in the event that emergency treatment was needed. That is what you need to do. So luckily, she walked through it well. And then from me, she received the paperwork in order to discharge the patient and further instructions. So it's funny little things like that just kind of pop up out of the blue. And it's like, okay, we need to discuss this. So
I think you're lucky, I guess lucky in that sense that the client had mentioned what they're about to do. Mm-hmm. What happens when they've done something and then they need to call you? Like, how is that a different conversation?
So usually when they've done something, then we have to go into, almost like crisis mitigation. Like, what do we need to do to cross your fingers, fix the issue that's currently there? And that can be a range of different things. And in other instances, so I don't do malpractice. A lot of times a client will call me up and say, oh, heavens to Betsy, the patient swallowed a burr. My first response is, and did you send them to the emergency room? Please tell me yes. Did you document everything? And then you need to call your malpractice carrier up, because I live in New York and they're going to sue. Even if there's no damages and there's no injury or nothing, the patient is generally going to sue. So, it's a matter of making sure that what needs to be done is done, and who the appropriate people are to call your malpractice, because they need to know that this just happened and they're going to be getting bills from that patient's emergency room visit. So did I answer the question, or did I just?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you definitely answered it. It's just, it's just, I don't think, so I know the kind of the suing culture is slightly different in the States. I think we're not far behind. I think we're kind of getting there, or the rest of the world is catching up. But yeah, I mean, it must be terrifying as a dentist sometimes, knowing that that's a threat.
So I mean, it's dealing with someone's health, and granted, it's dentists. It's not like the cardiac surgeon went, oops. Yeah, that's a terrible thing. Or the maternity, the labor and delivery doctor dropped something that he shouldn't have dropped. But it's still, patients get very concerned, and the provider should be concerned. And they should, I always tell clients, don't be your own attorney. Don't become a Google attorney. Don't become a Google accountant. Don't become a Google web designer, because those are all things where you're going to stick your foot in the mud, and it's going to cost you more money and more time to fix it after the fact. So, I always tell clients, if you need to call me for a 15-minute discussion on something, I would rather you do that than spend an hour doing it yourself and then find out you're going to have to hire me or someone else to fix it. It's much, much easier to go in knowing something than to go in not knowing it and then, for lack of a better way of putting it, mucking it up terribly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always, I never recommend people search for like their symptoms, because Google's always going to tell you you've got cancer.
Yeah, it's like, how do I have the Asian hippo flu? It's like, you don't have the Asian hippo flu, you have a cold. My sister's a nurse, and she Googles everything and then calls me up, and I'm like, Brandy, I promise you don't have that. You do not have an enlarged prostate. Only men can get that. And she's like, but I'm like, I don't care what symptoms you have. Don't Google it. It's never a good thing. Talk to your doctor or healthcare professional.
Can I just ask, is Asian hippo flu a thing?
No, it is not.
Did you make that from the fly? I love that.
But that's what I always tell my spouse. I'm like, you're fine. You do not have the Asian hippo flu. You have a cold, or depending on the season, it's allergies. I promise, you're not dying.
Excellent, love that. So, as you hopefully know, that this podcast is kind of specific, aimed at anyone sort of new to owning a practice. So anyone who's thinking about it, or has just brought a practice and is kind of thinking, uh-oh, what have I done? I would love to know from your side of things, like, if I'm buying a new practice, what do I need to know from a legal standpoint in the US?
So there's a couple things. This is kind of like an onion. So there's a couple things. Typically, dental practices are owned in some type of entity or professional entity, depending on the state you're in. If you're going to buy and you're looking in the future to purchase something, you need to know how long it takes to form a professional entity. In the state of New York, it can take 6 to 8 months. So you're talking a lot of leeway in order to get yourself set up to have your buyer prepared. New York is really, really incredibly stringent on naming guidelines, who can and can't own different dental practices. And so in order to be a dentist, in order to form a professional entity as a dentist, you have to be a licensed dentist. And then there's all these other weird things. A general dentist cannot use any term that indicates a specialty. So they can't use perio, endo, the word advanced, all these different things. But in New York, a general dentist who serves adults and children cannot use any term that refers to children or child, because that is a specialty in New York. Only pediodontists can use any term that references to a child. Now, in the same vein, a pediodontist cannot use the word family, cannot use the word adult, or anything that does not indicate a child. Why? Because it's a specialty. It's considered a specialty term, and only the specialties in New York can form it. So you need to have someone who knows what they're doing form your entity. Don't have your cousin Lou, who is a trust and estates attorney. That person, this is what happens. I get someone who comes to me and they're like, oh, well, we're in the process of forming an entity. My accountant, who is a general accountant, is forming it. And I would say to them, send me your entity application so that I can let you know why it's going to be rejected. And literally, and going into 12 years of doing this, every time someone who has not used me has had it formed, unless they were using their name, it's been rejected. And I'm able to look at it and go, you have the term associates and you're only one person. You can't have terms that indicate multiples when you're an individual, unless there are more than one member or shareholder. So there's that. And then you need to start, before you even have someone as a buyer, before you have a practice identified that you want to purchase, you should have your team ready. You should be talking to bankers. You should have an attorney. You should have an accountant. There are accountants in the state of New York and in New Jersey that just work with dentists like me, or the preponderance of their practice is dentist. So you want to have all of that stuff ready prior to being able to say, I've located the practice I want to purchase. It's very, very important to have the background work done before you engaging, because once you get a letter of intent or anything like that, you want to be able to have someone who negotiates those on a very frequent basis to be able to do that for you.
Fantastic. And are there any other sort of legal tasks or activities that you need to do before you buy that practice?
Well, I mean, so I guess the question. So there's all sorts of legal documents that go with it, like the asset purchase agreement. Is there going to be an employment agreement following closing, depending on how long the seller is going to stick around? Lease. You want to have the lease reviewed to make sure, if you're assuming a lease, you want to make sure that there's nothing in there that's too terribly offensive that you can't live with it. A lot of times with leases, because you're taking an assignment, you can't negotiate that very much of it because it's already a negotiated document. The landlord's going to be willing to usually offer extensions and one or two other minor things, but you still need to know what's in the lease. And so you want to have those types of things. And then, so like in New York, in the States, it's very, very important, restrictive covenants. The restrictive covenants are treated vastly different depending on where you are. And a restrictive covenant makes it so that the seller, once closing has occurred and their last day of services typically, that they can't do certain activities. They can't go out and solicit patients. They can't solicit the office staff. They can't work within a certain area, within a mile radius, within a specified mile radius of the purchased practice and things like that. So that way the seller who is selling all this goodwill and has a very recognizable name can't open up 3 doors away or 3 blocks away, and all of a sudden all the patients will migrate over because they know Dr. Jones. So those are important things to know. And one of the important things, so I only, once again, I think I've probably said this 50 times, I only deal with dentists. So like with restrictive covenants, it's very, very important. I generally know where the restrictive covenant is going to land and how it's going to work. So restrictive covenants, the time span for a seller is almost always 5 years. That's what I generally see. It's very rare to see a smaller time period following closing or last day of services. Now, the restricted area can be vastly different. It can be, So I live in Rockland County, which is across from Westchester County. It can be 10, 15 miles where I live. In New York City, it's going to be city blocks. It's going to be 30 city blocks north and south and river to river. So you're not talking the entirety of Manhattan Island. But the interesting part is, so I helped an orthodontist in Terre Haute, Indiana, a number of years ago. He had a 50-mile restricted area around his practice. That's pretty big. Like we think of that as like, holy mackerel, I can't believe that. Well, I lived out in Illinois for a number of years, and you would drive 50 miles to go see a doctor. You would drive 70, 80 miles to go see a doctor or a dentist. But the interesting thing there is, so his 50-mile radius around the practice that he bought probably has fewer patients than a 30 block north, 30 block south, river to river restricted area in Manhattan Island. Probably by millions. Like that, like Manhattan, you may have 2 or 3 million people in that restricted area. Whereas out in 50 miles of Terre Haute, Indiana, there may be 500,000, maybe, because of Indianapolis being close enough. But that's it. So, but you need someone to draft those types of documents who understands, like, I'll get documents from people who live upstate, and it's like, 25-mile radius in Westchester. I'm like, no, but number one, that's not enforceable. And number two, because of how this courts treat restrictive covenants, if you're unreasonable in your drafting, courts in New York will generally kick the entire restrictive covenant. So all of a sudden the buyer has nothing. And that's not a good place to be.
So do you have to get that right the first time round, or can you revise it?
No. Now,
you have to get it right.
It's best to get it right the first time around. Can you revise it so long as the two parties agree? If it goes to court and is litigated and it's deemed to be unreasonable, it's very likely the court's going to throw everything out. The court. New York used to revise unreasonable restricted covenants. That was a number of years ago. They generally don't do that anymore. They say that whoever has the restricted covenant against, the selling doctor, you've been unreasonable, and because of that, you get nothing. So it's very important to be reasonable in your drafting of restricted covenants, and to know what will and won't work. 5-mile restricted covenant in Brooklyn, it's not enforceable. You can agree to it all you please, but if there's litigation on it, I'm willing to bet my own eye teeth that restrictive covenant is not going to stand. The court is going to throw it out.
Throw it out. Wow. So so make sure you get that right, and obviously use someone that knows how to get an enforceable.
Courts are very, very. It's not that they're resistant to revising to make things reasonable. It's just that they won't do it anymore. They used to, but they won't pretty much anymore.
That's fair. Brilliant.
So, and the same thing goes for like employment agreements for dentists. Employment agreements, the restricted covenant is typically shorter in duration and smaller in area. So you need to make sure, people come in, well, I had this for my, when I bought the practice, I had this for the seller, and I want this for the employee. And it's like, that's apples and oranges. They don't compare, and you can't make one similar to the other. It just doesn't go that way.
Yeah, that's fair. So we just talked about some of the things that you need to do when you're buying a practice. Is it similar or different if you're starting a startup practice?
So now, mind you, when you purchase a practice, you're purchasing the goodwill, which is the name of and the records of the seller. So you kind of have a pre-made patient base. And, I always remind my buyers, there will be some attrition. You are not the seller. And some people they won't care for you or whatever. And you may not like some of the patients. And that's okay. So generally, they look at like 5 to 10% attrition, which is not bad at all. For startups, so they're doing they don't have a patient base. They have to get out on the street corner and, shake hands, kiss babies like a politician to get people to come to them. Forming the professional entity is the same thing. If you want to open up, you need to, before you get everything going, the lease and your potential build out, you need to start thinking about that professional entity. Because you don't, for liability purposes, it's always better not to hold things in your own personal name, not to hold the financing, not to hold the lease, none of those things. You want them all in your practice name. Now, for a dental startup, the one thing, I'd mentioned previously that when you buy a practice, you really can't negotiate the lease too much because somebody's already done that and you're just taking an assignment. There are some things that you can negotiate in and out. With a practice startup, your biggest, most important thing is the lease. Now, I review leases from I don't say patients, I mean clients who they didn't have a dental attorney review their lease. And it's like, okay, well, you have what's called a recapture provision, which means on assignment, the landlord has the potential of saying, I'm just going to take your space back. Get your stuff out, I'm taking the space back. Now that's a very, very detrimental thing, because I always joke with people, I'm an attorney. I need a computer, a phone, and internet access. And that's all I need to do my work. I can sit on the steps in Grand Central or Victoria Station and actually do my work. I don't need a specific place. Dentists are vastly different. A dental build out, I tell clients, if you're spending $500,000, you're getting a very basic dental build out. You're going to get you're going to get Formica countertops and stuff like that. If you're building an office in Manhattan Island, depending on where you are, you're going to spend $2 to $3 million, easy. This is a really expensive baby. This is more than a dinner out. So you want to make sure that lease is negotiated really, really well. You don't want to have recapture clauses, because sometime in the distant future, you're going to want to retire and go become a surf instructor in Hawaii. Great. You need to be able to assign that lease to your buyer without having to worry about what's the landlord going to do. The other important thing is what's called a relocation right. So some landlords want to be able to tell the tenant, I can move you at any time to a similarly situated space. Problem with that is what the landlord will do, and I say this because I've experienced it with clients who came to me, and while this was going on, the landlord says, I'm going to move you from suite A on the first floor to suite D on the sixth floor. So the landlord just takes the countertops and the cabinets and tries to make it fit as best as possible. So there's a 1-inch gap between the counter and the wall. And it's just a nightmare. It is always a nightmare and they say, well, it has to be substantially similar. And they're like, well, it is, it's the same square footage, never works. So that cannot be in a lease. And I'm very upfront with clients. If that is in a lease, I cannot tell you to sign that lease. And if you say I'm fine with it and you want to negotiate it, I won't do that for you, because I don't want to have in 5-6 years or whatever, you coming back to me as a tenant and saying, oh heavens, the landlord's moving me, and it's just a nightmare, because it's going to be. So two very important things in a lease for a startup. Either those are there and the landlord won't get rid of it. I tell clients, you cannot sign that lease. And if you're fine with that, you have to negotiate this with someone else, because I'm not going to allow that to happen to you. So the practice startup also needs to know who's going to do the build out. What's the experience of that person? You don't want to get, Bob's build out, who, their entity was formed a year ago. And, if you look up the sole shareholder, you see that in the past 10 years, he's had 12 entities, all of which have been So you need to get someone who's reputable and who knows what they're doing, and who can go and inspect the premises to make sure what it is you're thinking of doing is going to be doable there. So you need to have a good designer, a good contractor to build it out, and then you need to have somebody who's going to be able to go into the space and look at it. Is there anything I need to be aware of? Is there mold? I say that because last week I had somebody who the space we were looking at had black mold in the basement, and they were going to have the first floor in the basement, and so it killed it. I'm like, you can't take black mold. Is the electrical supply going to be adequate for your needs? Now, we always think of dentists, dentists in a lot of water. Well, that is very much, in fact, the case. Dentists use awful lot of water. But they're also energy hogs. They use a lot of energy. They have multiple x-rays, compressors, suction, all these various different things that use a lot of electricity. And what I always find kind of funny, looking at it from a different perspective, is everything becomes more efficient, and yet the dentist still uses more energy. It's like, how is it that everything in here is incredibly efficient, but when you go to the next efficient thing, you're using more energy? So I'm like, it's never that efficient. But I tell clients, not only do you need supply for today when you open your office, you need supply for 5 years and 10 years. And if you don't have that supply there, we need to either be able to figure out, can you bring it in, which is incredibly expensive, or is it there already? But if you need 100, I'm not an electrician, but if you need 100 amps for today, you should have 150, because whatever you're going to need in the future, it is going to take more than 100 that you're already consuming. So there are some very, very important things, and having someone who doesn't do general dentistry as an attorney, they're not going to think of recapture, because like you and me, if we had someone review our leases, they wouldn't. I wouldn't care. I can practice anywhere. You can probably do your business anywhere. An accountant can. That doesn't matter too much. But if you gloss over it because you think, oh, like an accountant, you don't care about the recapture or relocation, it's going to make a big difference. And, when I get clients who come in and they're like, oh my gosh, my landlord is moving me. It's like, you're stuck. I hate to break this to you. You are stuck with this, and you're just going to have to figure out how to make it work. Get some duct tape and super glue. And if you don't want somebody looking at something in front of them, put a nice sign behind them so that attracts their attention. You had your cousin Mary review this, and what does Mary do? Oh, well, she's a divorce attorney. Well, you need to divorce her from providing legal services unless you're getting a divorce. So it's areas of concern that people don't even know that are there, generally speaking.
Yeah, no, I love that, Robert. I love the fact that you're obviously clearly a dental attorney, but like you're even providing advice on construction.
Mm-hmm. Well,
that's fantastic.
I don't step into that too far because, like I said, I'm not going to become a Google contractor.
No, but it's just things you've learned.
Exactly. Like you need to talk to your contractor about this. You need to talk to your designer about that. So it changes how things work dramatically a lot of times. And it's like, this, I read the learning curve. I went over it the whole bit. So it's like I've done this, because like my clients, I always find it funny when my client says, well, this is the first time I've ever sold my dental practice. Well, since the start of the year, I have helped sell 28 dental practices and helped buy 37. So it's not my first time up, it's not my first time.
It's not your first rodeo.
Exactly.
Is that how many you sold this year or helped sell this year?
Those are just numbers.
Numbers.
I've done easily over 50 buy sell transactions this year, easily. And I ride both sides of the transaction.
Yeah, fantastic. So you do know, what it takes to buy or sell a dental practice.
And every transaction is different and special. But the thing is, when you've done well over 1,000 of them, it's like, well, you're buying your first practice, so this is special for you. But I've done so many of them, it's not anymore for me. It's like I know kind of where all the, where all the trap doors are that we don't want to fall through and stuff like that. So we'll do all right with this, I promise.
Fantastic, that's awesome. So Robert, based on your experience of having your own business and obviously working with a number of dental practice owners, what would you say is your number one piece of advice for anyone thinking about buying or starting a dental practice? Like, what's that one thing or a few things that they need to know?
So this is kind of just a reiteration of what I said earlier. Get an attorney who knows what they're doing. Find an accountant who knows what a dental practice is, and just have your team ready. The thing is, it might not be that Dr. Jones may have identified the practice she wants to buy, and I would say 90% of all practice transactions go through. But if something happens and it doesn't, you're prepared. You've already got your team ready to go on to the next one. I had two partners who were looking at a dental practice in Westchester County, and we worked on it, and it got to a certain, we had asset purchase agreement, employment agreement, we were doing the lease review, everything. And then all of a sudden it got to the point where it was a matter of, you guys should not buy this. This is not going to be good for you. And we sat down and we talked about it, and I explained to them like what my concern was. And they're like, fantastic. Tell the seller, have a nice day. We're no longer interested. And what it was it was a dentist who was licensed, it was an unlicensed dentist who was running the practice, and the dentist who was the practice owner lived in Florida and literally never came to New York. So there were a lot of questionable things going on. So it's like, okay. And luckily the clients were like, good. But like a month and a half, almost 2 months later, I get a call from them. We found someplace. Like, perfect. Have you had your accountant look at it? And let's start looking at it. Let's see what we need to do for a letter of intent. And that went swimmingly. It was very, very good. So you need to have a team. Now, there are a number of specific dental attorneys in the state of New York, New Jersey, that I work with frequently. What you don't want to have is me be your attorney, retain me as your attorney. And that way, if someone comes along and they're trying to sell, they don't what they call poison the well. They don't give me information because I'll be like, nope, I'm working with your buyer, or I'm working with your seller, and I can forestall that. Otherwise, there's conflict of interest type things which could make it so that your attorney can't work with either of you potentially. And I'm not one of these people. It's like, obviously attorneys bill on an hourly basis, but I'm there to be your resource. Like if we're not formally engaged, but we're talking and we're doing a lot, that's going to forestall anybody from using me. But call and ask questions. Don't do this alone, and don't do this through Google. Get your support people in place so that they're there whenever you need them.
Yeah, fantastic. Because we're not talking about small amounts of money here, are we? We're talking about probably quite large sums, and you don't want to lose that.
I mean, I always tell clients, this is more than just a nice dinner out.
Yeah.
And this is New York City, and you're in London, so a nice dinner out could be a lot of money, but even those.
But a practice could be more.
What was that?
Yeah, but a practice could be even more.
Exactly. Like I said, I had a client who's actually a good referral source. He was $1.75 million practice. That's a lot of money. I don't care who you are, unless your father is, oh gosh, all of a sudden it escapes me, Mark Zuckerberg. $1.75 million is a lot of money. That's more than most people's homes. So they always say that your house is your biggest investment. Well, that, as a general rule, yes. But if you're a business owner, and the type of business owner, your business is going to be your biggest investment, period. So you need to have someone who knows what they're doing. You don't buy a house without having a real estate attorney. Why? Because they're the ones who know what they're doing. You don't use, your tax accountant or your tax attorney or, mergers and acquisitions attorney in Manhattan. You use a real estate agent.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Robert, that is sound advice. And so finally, I would love to ask you, if anyone listening is thinking about buying or selling a dental practice in New York or New Jersey, or potentially would like to ask some information somewhere else in the country, how can they reach out to you?
So I'm very easy to reach out to. So I've got a website, dentallawoffice.com. So they can go on there and see a pretty picture of me wearing a tie and find out information like specifically what I do. And it's not, obviously it's not the kitchen sink. I didn't throw everything in there. I did like the big points. And then all my contact information is on there. But my phone number is 845-499-0220. And they can email me at robert@dentallawoffice.com. And somebody asked me the other day, are there one or two L's? And I'm like, well, it's dental with an L and law with an L. So there's two L's. And I'm pretty easy to reach.
Fantastic. Yeah. So I will leave those notes or those contact details in the show notes. But Robert, thank you so much for your time today. I've learned a lot more about you and dental law, which is fantastic. And I hope my viewers have as well. And I really appreciate your time.
Mike, it has been a pleasure. And it's been great getting to know you. And, like you said, if anybody has, if they have an oddball question or anything like that, give a call. We can talk for 5-10 minutes. It's not a problem.
Fantastic. And when I make it to New York, we're going out for tea.
Yes, definitely.
Brilliant. Perfect. Thanks, Robert. I'll talk to you soon.